So we now have a no-dig bed, which is 3 meters squared. We have learned about succession sowing and how useful it is when you've got a limited space, so that you can have as productive a cutting patch as possible. So now I'm going to show you how to plan what you're going to sow for the coming season if you can only direct sow your seeds. So we've got a 3 meter by 1 meter bed, and I want to create a plan that will take me through the full growing season, so I have as many plants or flowering stems as possible. So let's look at our bed. So if you haven't got the opportunity to sow your seeds inside, which is certainly possible, which is which may well be the case. So if all you can do is direct sow into your new no-dig bed, then really you need to, your season doesn't start until really the last frost date. So for here, where I am, the last frost date is around about the 15th of May, so mid-May. So the most I would do for planning to direct sow outside is to sow something on the 1st of May. So that's the earliest I would plan. That date may change for you depending on where you are in the world, but take a frost free date and maybe take off 2 weeks to give yourself a little bit of gap. But don't go too soon, because you will just find it difficult to protect from the frost. If you have a means of protecting that bed from the frost, so if you can create a tunnel, a protected tunnel that you can grow the plants in, then by all means start it earlier. And perhaps you're looking at the plan that I will create for the no direct sowing method. So that will be next in the next video. But if you're looking to sow your seeds direct and you've got no way of protecting your seeds and no way of planting them inside, then the 1st of May for me is the earliest I will start sowing something. So I have up in the right hand corner the list of flowers that I am thinking of planning to plant. So these are all, they all fit to be able to direct sow, apart from dahlias, which is an anomaly, which we'll cover when it gets to the point of doing that. But I'm saying that on the 1st of May I sow my first set of seeds. So we can put those in. So each row is different. So my bed, as you can see from the symbol at the side, north is going upwards. So I want all of the high plants to make sure that they don't shade out the smaller plants. So in this instance, A, which is sunflower, and F, which is Amimagus, both of those can grow quite tall, as can the cosmos. So they're put towards, well, I've kept them to one side, mainly because the sun will be coming from the front and going across during the day. So the longer piece of sunshine will be from the left hand side. So from flower B, the zinnias, forward. So we've got you could split the bed up so that you've got all of the tall ones at the back. It depends which way your sun is shining, or which direction you've got your bed. So this is mine. So I'm having all of the tall flowering plants to one side, and equally the sunflowers and the Amimagus need a little bit more room, and potentially the cosmos need a bit more space than the other plants to grow in. Each square represents 20 centimetres square, so I'm saying that for every 20 centimetres a plant will be put in. with cut flowers, you can allow yourself to plant closer because it's about the productivity rather than the display, which if it was in a garden you would plant them much further apart because you want a better looking plant. In a cut garden, it doesn't matter how they look as long as it's producing lots of flowers. So we're giving the sunflowers, the cosmos and the amimajors a little bit more room, but equally we can the plan is to be roughly 20 centimetres apart, and most annual seeds that you would be sowing for a cutting patch is about 20 centimetres apart. Now I'm being very generalistic, so you do need to check each flower because it will change per flower, but that's broadly what we're looking at. So 1st of May I am planting out all of the seeds in my list. So I've only got a list of 6 and they will be with me throughout the whole season. Direct sowing means that we have a little bit more limitation on the variety that we can have because you've got more time with the seeds in a growing stage rather than in a flowering stage. So at this point, 1st of May, if there's a frosty night, we still need to protect from frost. Week 2, the plants have hopefully started to germinate. Some may not, but normally cutting flower plants germinate within 2 weeks. So we're looking at germination. So you've still got nowhere near creating a bed that will be providing you with any flowers. It's still all in the growing phase. Week 3, which is now our last frost date, so we can stop protecting it from frost, although if there is a frost we still need to be careful. We should hopefully have our first batch starting to have germinated and growing on, but again we're only in the growth stage, so it's all just green, no flowers yet. But now it's the last frost date, we can start planting the dahlias. So I've put in 3 dahlias in here. Now again, dahlias take up a bit of space, so you may not want to have the dahlias, but for me, cutting garden without dahlias doesn't seem right. So I've got 3 dahlias in there. Week 5, which is the 1st of June, then we're back to starting some more sowing. So we're doing, because we've got such a limited space, then we can't expect to have lots of flowers growing at once and expect to be able to fill lots of vases in the house week on week. So, you know, we've got to be realistic. In a 3 by 1 metre bed, we can only grow so many plants, so many flowering plants at any one time. So we could be succession sowing twice every 2 weeks or every 3 weeks, but in reality every month is probably more appropriate, because of the number of plants that you can fit in, and therefore the number of cuttings that you can do will be limited. But you can work back based on the space you've got as to how many stems you need to create the number of vases that you want to and therefore how many plants you need. So there's all sorts of workings that you can go back to do that. So week 5 we're doing the second sowing, so we've planted in the same flowers again. You could add in extra varieties. Succession sowing doesn't necessarily mean that you have to stick with the same plant and the same varieties, but it just means that you're staggering the growth. So you're planning to have different flowers in bloom at different stages throughout the season. So second batch is sown the 1st of June. So mid-June, we have got the first batch, with a lot more growth on them, but still unlikely to have any flowers. Dahlias will be growing, but nothing there, and the second batch will be hopefully germinated by that point. And again, that's where we are. So no flowers to pick as of the 14th of June. But 14th of June, we can start planning for next year. Crazy, I know. But we start if we sow biennials now in the middle of June, then we will have plants available next year for this time, this exact time where there's a lull. So we can do exactly the same thing next year, but we will already have these biennials in the ground ready to flower. So first year, there is always going to be a gap in June. But next year, you can plan a bit further ahead and start doing something extra. So we sow the biennials 14th of June. Now I've put them in the area next to the dahlias because the dahlias will be growing. The biennials will be small for quite some time. They are not going to take off. They're not going to bloom or anything. So they're just going to be small plants right the way throughout this season because it's the second season that they flower. So we are good to go with the biennials mid-June. So when it comes to the 1st of July, we're looking at the third batch of flowers. Now, hopefully by the 1st of July, that first sowing that you made in May is now starting to flower. It may be, we're still only week 9 in, so it may be that that's still a bit too soon, but you may find that some of them are in flower. Batch 2, still in the early growth stage of those seedlings. Dahlias won't be flowering yet in July. So you may have a few flowers, depending on what type of flowers you've sown, but it's not going to be a vast amount. Biennials, again, just learning to germinate. So week 11, mid-July, again, dahlias will be bushing up. You should, now it's mid-July, have that first batch of flowers starting to bloom. So pretty much every flower should be starting to bloom at this point of time, or every variety. Some might be sooner than others, but you should be you should have something that you can pick at this point in time. The second batch is still growing, so they're still coming through. Biennials should have germinated, but they are still, there's going to be no flower. You can expect no flowers from them this year. So now we've come into August. So it's the 1st of August. So again, we are potentially looking at a new batch to sow. But when we look at what's already there, we should have our first batch fully in flower, our second batch pretty much grown, ready to flower. Biennials are just sitting there waiting to do their thing for next year. Our third batch are just sprouting up. And so at this point in time, you can decide whether you want to sow a fourth batch or not. And the reason why I'm saying possibly is because of, depending on your circumstances, then the last frost date may be too soon to make this fourth batch viable. So if your last frost date is before mid-October, then sowing on the 1st of August is probably a bit tight as to whether you will get any blooms that are worth flowering, because most flowers are 12 weeks from germination to blooming, and therefore that will take you they'll only start blooming when you're potentially getting your first frosts. So it may be worth thinking whether you are going to bother sowing anything at this point. I've put this new orange patch in, so the fourth batch in for just to illustrate it, but for me personally, I probably wouldn't sow this because the dahlias will be starting to bloom. So any flowers that you're using in that flower list could be usurped by the dahlias at this point. So I may not be thinking too much about these extra flowers. I mean, there will be some that I will be using, but for foliage, then maybe you could start looking at the cosmos. The leaves on them are quite good for foliage rather than the flowers. So it's something to bear in mind. So look at how your garden is growing. You should be in full flight of cutting at the moment, and going into it. So it's just really up to you as to whether you decide to continue with that batch sowing. Mid-August, and actually, if you think about it, if your last frost date is mid-October, then actually the batch sowing dates might be more appropriate to be the middle of the month, so that you could get a fourth batch in or a last batch in mid-July that would take you and be usable up to the last frost. Whereas sowing in on the first of the month actually means that we're missing that last batch sowing. So depending on your circumstances, you may want to adjust those timings and see where you are. But as of mid-August, everything should be in full flower for that first batch. Second batch is starting to come up, so you may well have fully consumed that first batch. Second batch is starting to flower, biennials sitting there doing nothing. Third batch starting to sprout up. Fourth batch, if you've sown it, are still in the germination stage. But come 1st of September, we're looking at getting rid of it. So that first batch would definitely have been fully spent by now. So you'd clear that out. You may have cleared it sooner than the 1st of September. It's best to clear it out as soon as you can. As soon as those flowers are finished, there's no point keeping them there. You may as well clear it out and make space for the new seedlings that are coming up, rather than keeping them there just in case. So if there's only 1 or 2 flowers left on some of the plants, clear them out whenever you can, so that you're making more space for the other ones. But by the 1st of September, I would have expected that first batch to have been cleared out. And scrolling through everything else is growing at the different stages that are appropriate. And at this point, we're also sowing in hardy annuals. So again, we're starting to look at next year. So these hardy annuals, which may well be some of the ones that we've got here, although sunflower zinnias, cosmos, don't need it. Larkspur could well be something that you plant. Amimajus, I can't remember whether the burpler is a hardy annual or not. But you start putting in those plants now. So things like snapdragons that take a long time to germinate, they would be good to plant out this time. Amimajus means that we're getting it in there now. They're not going to be anything that you would cut this season. You are just getting them germinated and settled in for the winter. They are hardy, so they will last the winter, and they will be ready to shoot up and flower sooner than what we've had in this particular season, this growing season. So we've got those in, and after clearing out what we can. So come mid-September, everything's ticking along. Nothing really much more to do. 1st of October, you're clearing out what's spent. So making room for everything else. Don't leave it in longer than you need to. Mid-October, really, we're looking at, again, just clearing things out. I don't know what happened there. 1st of November. Now, by the 1st of November, most people are looking at getting close to, if not passing, their first frost date. So really, all of the flowers that you've sown this season that were used for cuttings should be cleared out by now. You're also wanting to have lifted the dahlias so that they're protected and ready for overwintering. So all of this season's plants taken out. The biennials still in there, so they're still ready for winter, but they will grow, they'll become dormant and they will grow throughout the winter. That doesn't make sense. They will be dormant. They've grown enough to withstand the winter and they will be dormant. The same with the hardy annuals. You've got to have sown them early enough so they've got a bit of growth on them, they've got a good root system, and then they will become dormant for the winter, ready to spring into action come spring. And at this point, once the dahlias are cleared out, you can start planting your spring bulbs. If you're wanting tulips, they would have been planted probably earlier, maybe in September time, whereas if it's tulips, then you can plant them up to, or even after the first frost. You can plant them up until January in reality. because they only take about 3 months to grow. But normally, you know, if you want to be organised around about November, plant them out. They can be, for a cutting garden, they can be really tightly packed in because you will be lifting them again in September. You'll be lifting them again once they're flowered in, let's say, May time. So in preparation for the dahlias going out, the tulips would be lifted. So you'd expect all of your spring bulbs to be completed to plant out your dahlias. Obviously, this all depends on whether you're planting dahlias. If you're not using dahlias, you've got more bed to plant other flowers. But, you know, your selection of flowers is really based on your choice and what you would like to use. But we've got, let's say we've got the tulips in. So at this point in time, we're ready for winter. So now, when it comes to the 1st of May, so it's back to where we started earlier, we had a blank canvas when we started this first season, but now we've got biennials. They won't be in flower. I've put them pink, but they won't yet be in flower. We're looking at June for that. When there was no flowers, if you remember, in June. Hardy annuals, again, they'll be starting to grow. They're probably not going to be in flower, but again, they will be in flower in June as well. June, this current year that we've just had, we had nothing. We had nothing until July. So we are getting flowers earlier by pre-sowing them in the autumn. Tulips will be in flower, so you will have something at that point. So you've got something now in your second season that will be in flower that you can use for your floral arrangements, and you will have flowers at least a month earlier than what you had before. And this is still direct sowing. So this is still only using your bed to create your cut flowers. It's not taking up space in your house on windowsills. It's not taking up space in a greenhouse or requiring you to have a greenhouse. It's just making sure, it's just making use of a bed that you've made available for cuttings. So if you want to have a go at direct sowing, then certainly you can create a viable cutting patch, albeit with probably a shorter growing season than if you were able to plant out the seeds separately and get them growing prior to planting them out. But it's still something that you could do if that's useful for you. So there we have it. That's how I would plan if I was direct sowing my seeds in my cutting patch. I would plan to sow monthly. By all means, you pick the date that is easily memorable for you, based on your first and last frost dates, and pick the flowers that you want. You can now go and look at all those seed catalogues and decide what you want to sow for the coming year. Happy planting.